Good evening. Welcome to Park Hill United Methodist Church. My name is Reverend Genevieve Rarrett-Navin, and my pronouns are she, her, hers, and I serve here as the executive pastor. Tonight, we gather during Holy Week for this Good Friday worship service. It is a time that invites us into reflection upon the meaning and significance of the crucifixion. It is a time for us to remember the crucifixion as Jesus' divine act of radical solidarity with others, particularly the marginalized, suffering at the hands of oppressive regimes, systems, and structures, both of his time and of ours. The theme for the evening is strange fruit, the last 7 sayings of Jesus. This theme is inspired by the song Strange Fruit that was written and composed by Abel Maripol under his pseudonym Lewis Allen and recorded by Billie Holiday in 1939. The lyrics were drawn from a poem by Maripol published in 1937. The song protests the lynching of Black Americans with lyrics that compare the victims to the fruit of trees. Such lynchings had reached a peak in the southern United States at the turn of the 20th century, and the great majority of victims were Black. The song has been called a declaration and the beginning of the civil rights movement. We will hear this song sung throughout the evening as our preachers come to share messages with each of us focused on one of the last words or sayings of Christ on the cross, but through the lens of this song. This time is a heavy one. It is okay for you to not be okay during this time. It is okay for you to feel all that Good Friday brings and all that it reminds us of in our own lives and our collective lives. We have people from our tender, loving care team here in case you need support at any time. If you find yourself in need of support during the service, please feel free to raise your hand and one of our ushers will help get a TLC member connected with you. Our service tonight will end with the ending of our thematic song, and we will recess in silence. Join me now for a word of prayer. Holy One, we come before you this Good Friday evening, aware that you intimately know the suffering present in this world. You have cried out in pain from the violence brought down upon you, the hands of those in power. You have disrupted destructive systems and you have felt their terror rain down upon you. You have chosen to know what it is like to fully experience the human in this world. And God, in this moment, we thank you for your deep and abiding love for humanity. In our gratitude, we sit here alongside your suffering, contemplating the ways of the world. May your Holy Spirit be our guide tonight.
So, children, if you're watching this tonight, you can go ahead and look at your Shine On Story Bible. If you don't have one of these, we'll make sure any Sunday you come that you can get one, and I'll put these page numbers in the YouTube chat and Facebook as well. But on 264, you can see parts of Holy Week after Palm Sunday. We have the Last Supper. The very next page is when Jesus is arrested. That's on 266. And then we get to Jesus' death, and we'll hear these stories tonight in this preaching tonight. And I want you to make sure that you know that it's okay to have hard conversations. It's okay to have sad conversations. And the adults in the household, I want you to also know that you don't have to finish a conversation, and you don't have to have all the answers or any answers during your conversation. But we must start the conversations, if nothing else, during Holy Week. And during Maundy Thursday and Good Friday and Holy Saturday, we must have the conversations. We cannot get from Palm Sunday to Easter without Holy Week. So please, if you want to see where we got to this, 264, there's a lot of pages before that number. So feel free to see how we get to this part of the story. And you don't have to finish the conversation. You don't have to have all the answers, but please start having the conversations of how we get to Good Friday and how we get to Easter. Go ahead and repeat after me and say a prayer. Thank you, God.
Thank you, God.
For hard conversations. May we start tonight and tomorrow. And now we all say together, Amen.
Two other notes of housekeeping for you all. For those that are new to this space, if you need a restroom, you can find those by going out of the sanctuary doors, and then another set of doors to the left, and then on the left will be the restrooms. Additionally, if you haven't seen it already in front of you, there is a QR code that can take you to the outline of worship that you can follow along there, as well as, of course, on our screen. I have the honor now of introducing some folks to you all tonight. As I introduce you, please stand. From Park Hill UMC, the two people that helped craft our sacred time together are our lead pastor, Reverend Dr. Valerie L. Jackson, she, her, hers, and our minister of worship and arts, Daryl J. Walker, he, him, his. Our soloist tonight, Auburn Shale Joseph, she, her, hers, is a talented artist who studied at the San Francisco Conservatory of Music through physical, visual, oral, and aural, AURAL. She aspires to evoke and provoke through art. John Hurst, he, him, his, is a recent transplant to Denver from New York City, here to pursue a Master's of Divinity at the Iliff School of Theology. He is a self-described educator, artist, lover, and diasporic soul who brings a deep love for the intersection of art and spirituality. Reverend Emily Fleming, she, her, hers, leads Christ United Methodist Church here in Denver. Emily has many passions and even more energy. I can attest to that. She loves the mountains, music, travel, craft beer, wine, and spirits and friends around the world. Reverend Bick T. Betty Newen, she, her, hers, is a United Methodist clergywoman and serves as the multicultural and advocacy ministries developer for the Mountain Sky Conference of the UMC. She is passionate about learning how to bridge across difference, believing that relationships transform lives and communities. Reverend Joanne Bell Haynes, she, her, hers, is the Executive Regional Minister for the Central Rocky Mountain region of the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ, in the United States and Canada. She enjoys spending time with her family, music, dancing, theater, travel, and roaming around art galleries and wineries. And we have Karen Ware Joseph, she, her, hers. Karen is the Chief Operating Officer at the Iliff School of Theology here in Denver. In her leisure time, Karen enjoys listening to music, writing, stitching needle art, researching the next subject that piques her curiosity, developing new projects, and most of all, spending time with her family. It is with deep gratitude for all of you that I welcome you tonight to Park Hill United Methodist Church.
Here is a strange and bitter crop.
Gospel writer of Luke says this: after they had crucified him, Jesus simply said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." These words spoken by Jesus while dying on the cross are some of the most debated among scholars about their authenticity. Scholars debate whether Jesus actually said these words. The debate stems simply from the fact that in some of the earliest manuscripts of the Gospel of Luke, these first words are strangely missing. There are some copies of the Gospel of Luke that record Jesus saying, "Father, forgive them," and there are many others that do not. Upon further research, scholars have realized that the omission of these words is not that Jesus did not speak them, but rather because in the early stages of the growth of the Christian church, early church leaders decided to delete them because of the growing tension between Christian and Jews. The early Christian church was still bitter and broken about the death of Jesus the Christ and wanted the Jews to be held accountable for their role in nailing Jesus to the cross. Some scholars suggest when the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, the Christian church looked on it as a sign that God had not forgiven the Jews for their role in crucifying Jesus. Therefore, some early church leaders decided to take erasers to their manuscripts and delete these words that Jesus spoke from the cross. The debate comes from the deletion, but the deletion comes from the realization of how challenging it is to live up to these words that Jesus utters from the cross. Early church leaders realized what we all know to be true still today, that sometimes it ain't that easy to forgive those who have done us wrong. It is hard to exercise forgiveness in a world where it seems around every corner evil lurks rearing its ugly head, attempting to burden us with bitterness, oppress us, steal and rob us of the joy and the love of this world. So if you know that it is difficult to forgive, if you find it impossible to muster the strength to utter the words of forgiveness to those who have harmed you, all we need do is hang out just a few moments with Jesus at the cross. You see, in order to speak while nailed to the cross required even more difficulty, even more agony. One would have to lift themselves up on the nails and breathe in with a battered and beaten back, expand the diaphragm to pull in air in order to utter these words. Park Hill, this was not easy for Jesus to do. What Jesus illustrates in this moment is in such a human way is the complex relationship between freedom and those who have done us wrong. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Really? I wrestle deeply with this idea. When Judas kissed Jesus, didn't he know? When Peter denied Jesus, didn't he know? Didn't they know in 1619 when the first enslaved Africans were brought to the shores of this country? They knew in 1845 when Manifest Destiny would lead to the slaughter and dislocation of Native Americans all across this country? In 1865, Jim and Jane Crow, they knew. After World War II, Auschwitz, Holocaust, Nazi Germany, they knew. March 13th, 2020, when the police carried out a no-knock warrant ending in the senseless murder of Breonna Taylor in her own bed, they knew. On March 25th, 2020, when Derek Chauvin had his knee on George Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, they knew. January 6, 2021, on the steps of the U.S. Capitol, they knew. March 2023, when state legislatures in Florida, Tennessee, and Arkansas passed anti-LGBTQ legislation, they knew. Empire always knows. Those who design and lead and uphold broken systems to maintain broken promises and ignore broken people, those who stand silently in the face of injustice, they are complicit and they always know. Perhaps, they did not recognize the internal implications, the consequences of their actions, but I contend that just like the soldiers who carried out the execution of Jesus the Christ, the mob that was reveling around at the execution, they knew just what they were doing. So when Jesus says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do, it becomes complicated and difficult. There is a complex relationship between our own personal freedom and those who try to steal it from us. Far too often we use this text as a justification for what Bonhoeffer calls cheap grace. That to be a good Christian of moral character is to forgive others without extending any kind of grace to oneself. Somehow, it has been drilled into our religious subconscious and our Christian faith that in order for us to prove our devotion to God, we must lay our whole selves down at the foot of those who have treated us badly, despitefully used us, and mistreated us just to say we are good Christians. Father, forgive them, Why is it that when we know the assassination is financed by the government, the violence is sanctioned by the state, and the rape and the murder is rationalized and even spiritualized by the religious elites, it is our first requirement to forgive? Forgiveness is complicated work because forgiveness is the work of redemption. It must be the work of restoration. It is also the work of loving, which is hard work and hard to do. While nailed to the cross, Jesus is seeing the very people whom he healed, fed, taught, and loved revel at his death, and yet he is petitioning grace. At first glance, it seems as if in this moment, Jesus is offering up yet another divine example. But if we look closer, he is also teaching in a profoundly human way that sometimes we can only carry people for so long. When we look at the text, Jesus never says, "I forgive them." Never. He says, "Father, forgive them." Sometimes the justice fatigue overtakes us. Sometimes the death and the death-dealing things of this world break us down, leaving us dangling at the end of our rope. Sometimes we find ourselves having the authority and the ability, but lacking the capacity to forgive. I suggest to you this evening, it's okay. It's okay sometimes to not be ready to make nice with those who have done us wrong. It's okay to not always have the capacity to forgive those who have oppressed and abused us. The irony of this first word is that Jesus, the model, the Messiah, the one who laid down his life, Jesus, fully human and fully divine, in this moment still keeps his own agency and recognizes yet his own capacity to do what only God could do in that moment. The work of liberation is a co-laboring kind of work with God. I think for some of us, in this moment, Jesus can be a model for us. A model for not just how to forgive, but for what one does when one reaches the capacity to do anything else. Or in the words of Howard Thurman, when we find ourselves with the backs against the wall. The complicated work of forgiveness requires surrender and humility. It is the work of recognizing and honoring the limitations of our own flesh. It is the work of release. That part of the work has to be surrendered to a God that is able to do anything but fail. A God who has the ultimate capacity and the bandwidth to forgive 100 times over, to embrace humanity with radical, unconditional, life-transforming love. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do.
Around noon today, my family stopped what they were doing. They couldn't believe their eyes because I stood before my mother and my husband with no words. That may not be funny to all of you, but for those of you who know me, I talk a lot. In fact, I get paid to talk. I love this profession of proclaiming the gospel, and I always have words. I always have an opinion or a song or something to share. And today, this afternoon, as I considered the great honor of standing in this pulpit tonight, I had no words. Because you see, I recognize that on this esteemed panel of preachers who you invited to share a good word with you, my skin color is the only one that will represent the empire and the colonialism so present in our country then and now. I understood, not for the first time, but in a different way, in a deeper way, what it feels like to be the one, the minority, the only. And I felt a burden. How shall I bring you a good word for Good Friday with the second saying, today you shall be with me in paradise? And so I stopped to pause, to pray, to seek counsel from my family, and I believe that pausing to remember and to connect is what this season is all about. Compassion, compassio, with suffering. How can I sit alongside Christ? How can we, as white people and black people and people of all colors, how can we silence our egos and listen deeply to those who are suffering all around us? Even when their stories and their experiences are entirely unfamiliar or even uncomfortable to us. Through the rituals of Holy Week, we join Jesus in his ministry, in his torture, his death, and ultimately in his most important teaching. Love God. Love yourself. Love everyone else. And while the crowd mocked and belittled him, Jesus took the energy that Brother John reminded us that it takes to pour out compassion, to find his breath and speak to one of those criminals who was hanging beside him. How often do we deride that which we do not understand? From my childhood in rural South Carolina to the 12 years I spent in Germany, in German cities, to the past decade of pastoral ministry here in Colorado and in Utah, I have witnessed how often we, the people, minimize and marginalize and discredit whatever goes against the story that we tell ourselves, or perhaps even the stories that we were told as children. But Jesus' own religious group did not believe that he was God's son. They did not believe that he had the power to save himself. Think back, it has only been a few days since Palm Sunday, when a crowd of people thought that Jesus was their long-expected warrior king, entering Jerusalem to liberate them from the Roman Empire. They waved their palms and they threw down their cloaks as pledges of allegiance, ready to join the revolution. The people were hungry for war and for a new exodus, the end of their enslavement from the conquering colonialist. But instead of war, Jesus spoke to them of peace. Where they sought violence, he taught compassion. The people were so angry that they quickly became a lynch mob, crying out for his murder because he had failed to meet their expectations. How often do we fail to meet the expectations of others? How often do we fail to extend grace to those who disappoint us? Jesus and the other two men hanging beside him were all strange fruit, weighing heavily on unnaturally bent trees into the form of crosses. But one of the criminals went along with the chiding sneers and deriding comments of the crowd, while the other criminal took a stand for Jesus. Luke 23, 40-42 says, responding, the other criminal spoke harshly to the first criminal. Don't you fear God, seeing that you've also been sentenced to die? We are rightly condemned, for we are receiving the appropriate sentence for what we did. But this man has done nothing wrong. And then he turned and he said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. No matter what this man had done before this day, before this moment, no matter what crimes he had committed to deserve this death sentence, Christ offered him resurrection, a new life, just as Christ offers to us today, to all people who choose to listen, to believe, and to follow him. Verse 43 says, Jesus replied, I assure you that today you will be with me in paradise. This second saying is often called the word of salvation. It's as much for us today as it was for that repentant criminal on Golgotha's hill. We, each of us, are still desperately in need of God's love and redemption. Consider Billie Holiday, a musical legend who I became enamored with during high school. I loved her music and the poetry and the artwork of the Harlem Renaissance. And so I read her autobiography as a young teenager. And I was shocked to learn that the shining beauty and depth of a singing voice like hers was born twisted in the roots of deep intergenerational violence and trauma and addiction and suffering. Today would have been Lady Day's 108th birthday. She died from complications of drug and alcohol abuse, her attempts to silence the demons in her own past. She died in 1959 at the age of 44, which is consequently exactly my own age this year. And when I think of her, I hear a tune in my heart. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child, a long way from home. A group of clergy sang that song together with our bishop in the Holy Land a few years ago before COVID, when we could travel, and we descended a staircase into a deep hole, the hole which presumably was the place where Jesus spent his last living night on earth. And our bishop, who loves to sing, reached the bottom of that pit, and she looked around at us with a blank look on her face, which is also surprising for her, for those of you who know Bishop Karen Oliveto. And she said, I can't think of a song sad enough for this place, for this occasion. Does anyone have a song? And we all stared around at one another, intimidated and afraid, and that's the song that came from the depths of my soul. And we sat in the darkness, stood in the darkness. There wasn't enough room to sit, and we sang together. Jesus knows how we feel. Jesus knows how we wrestle to forgive, how we wrestle to reconcile our skin color, our stories, our experiences with all of that which is going on around us. And as we look at Billie Holiday's life and her legacy, as we examine the legacy of Jesus Christ, as we look at our own lives and what legacies we are creating for our children, I feel that we must cry out tonight for action. How can we bring beauty and peace to our world when it seems so filled and obsessed with violence? I believe that we begin by pausing to pray, to take a moment in silence, to open ourselves to the pain of others. When we are compasio, when we choose to be with others in their sufferings, we then pour ourselves out in an act like kenosis, which encourages the death of our egos and our own self-righteousness about our stories and our truths. And in that space of emptiness, we leave room for God to fill us with new life. Radical acceptance and hospitality, wild love that knows no bounds. And our own traumas and suffering and pain builds resilience. For there is power in the pain of the cross, and there is beauty in the promise of resurrection and new beginnings. Today, all of you who choose the way of love, all of you will be with Jesus in paradise. Amen.
Pastoral scene of the gallant South, a long way from home.
The third saying comes from John chapter 19, verse 26. Woman, behold thy son. Behold thy mother. Before I reflect on these words, I would like to lift up just a few things. The reflection tonight comes from my own experiences, wonderings, imagination, curiosity, culture, and context. I'll be reflecting a little bit about family relations, especially mother and child, and recognize that some of us have been in situations when those relationships are ideal and life-giving. For some of us, the relationship is nuanced and rocky at best, and some relationships cannot be even maintained. So thank you for your grace as we hold this space with nuance and hopefully with care and consideration. I grew up in the church, a Methodist, and this passage, of course, comes up every year during Easter, right? And verse 24, leading up to this verse, the saying of Jesus is this: while the soldiers were looking after themselves, Jesus' mother, his aunt, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene stood at the foot of the cross. Close, oh, so close to that cross, to be able, as Brother John said, to hear Jesus say, woman, behold thy son. They were very close, I imagine, to that cross. And as I've been growing up all these years, up till this year, I've always been confused about why Jesus called his earthly mother woman. That's another sermon. But I always thought maybe this was a way to comfort his earthly mother. Perhaps it was a way to tell her, I'm not going to be with you, so I'm leaving somebody to be with you. But the past several weeks, as I've been wrestling and preparing for this, Luis Garcia was shot while he was sitting in his car leaving school. He's a Denver East High School student, this high school that my son also attends. Mary, who is at the foot of the cross, witnessed the execution of her son. Her heart was broken, ripped out of her chest. The song, Strange Fruit, the last verse says, "Here is a strange and bitter cry." Mary, I imagine, cannot bear the thought of opening her heart to another person, another child, only to potentially have him lynched and executed, and also her heart tear open and her heart ripped out of her chest again. Mary, at the heart of the cross, may have run the memories of Jesus through her head, all the feels and the memories, how you can hold joy and fear and sadness all at the same time. Remembering she was carrying that Christ child on that dusty road, on that darn, strong donkey, and given birth in a stable, in a lonely, terrified situation. Only a mother's love can carry her through those moments. Rocking him in his sleep, keeping Jesus safe and comfortable while fleeing for their lives. Remember Jesus' laughter and cute little voices as a toddler, feeding him, making sure he can navigate around the home and avoid the sharp edges and Joseph's carpentry tools. Combing his hair, wiping the dust off his face, making sure he's having fun with his friends in the neighborhood, wondering if he's even aware that he is the Christ child, that he is Emmanuel, God with us, and wondering if he's flexing it with his friends. Who, Mary, when Jesus was a preteen, decided to stay at that temple? Remember that? And she had to go back along with Joseph to look for him, and from afar, wondering what this child is doing. Terrified and probably smiling a proud smile at the same time. Mary, who at that moment looked at her son, or surrounded by teachers and curious people, perhaps may be wondering if this son of hers is beginning to stir up good trouble. Witnessing him turn water into wine, seeing him live into his own voice and calling, hearing from others about her son, teaching, healing, challenging authority, learning about the polarizing voices and opinions about her son. All of these feelings of joy and being proud and scared, worried and loving for this Jesus at the foot of the cross. Perhaps her weary, broken heart cannot take it anymore. No, I will not accept him as a son. No, this has to stop. No, this cannot happen to another son of mine. Are you weary? Are your hearts broken? Are we hearing the bitter cries of the moms and the parents? Recently, I watched the movie Till. Do we hear the ringing of Miami Till's voice today? Tamika Parker's, Breonna Taylor's mom, Wanda Cooper Jones, Ahmaud Arbery's mom, and so many other moms and dads and parents and community. Are our hearts broken and our hearts ripped out of our chest? I have found that my heart sometimes have been calloused. Apathy, denial, our country, our world at times, shooting after shooting, murder, dignity and agency ripped away from those in power. Strange fruit is still everywhere today, maybe not on a tree or on the cross, but on the ground, in homes and beds, in cars and carts, and in legislative chambers. May our hearts still feel the pain and break open like Mary did. May we have the fire in our bellies to say, no, no more. Jesus, did not just talk to his earthly mother. He talked to his brother in ministry, your mother. We are in this together. It's not that family or that community or that high school or that city or that place over there. Our children, our parents, our community, this is us. And we cannot ignore and remove ourselves. But thank God we have one another. And thank God we have God's Spirit guiding us through. So we don't have to say no more, no more, no more any longer.
The gospel writer Mark penned these words. And at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? Forsaken so that we might know that we know that we know. Come with me, God's beloved, into forsakenness. I remember how protective my mom and dad were with us growing up. 6 daughters and then a son. My dad was really happy. 7 of us. We were never alone. They shuffled us everywhere we had to go. I remember in my senior year of high school, my first bus ride on the public school bus. I was near graduation and thinking, I've never traveled anywhere by myself. I remember Mom and Dad being very uncomfortable with me when I went off to college and started talking about getting rides back home with friends. She was like, oh no, you will wait until your dad comes to get you. We don't want you disappearing on some God-forsaken road. Some God-forsaken road between Macon, Georgia and Albany, Georgia. 2 hours. Some God-forsaken road. I couldn't remember I was trying to figure out what place could there be that God was not there. They were afraid because they knew things. They had stories tucked deep down in themselves about young boys mostly disappearing on the way somewhere and later being found hanging from a tree in the swamps of southern Georgia. They knew things. They knew about being God-forsaken. They knew things, and they worked hard every day to protect us from those things. But sometimes, it didn't work. Today, for just a minute, I want to talk about Jesus in a forsaken place. Jesus knew things. Jesus knew he was protected because he knew the Torah. Jesus knew God was with him. Well, how do you know that, Reverend Joanne? Oh, you ask such good questions. Because our sacred book tells us that at 3 p.m, strange fruit on an old rugged cross. At 3 p.m, Jesus was crying out to the God who he knew loved him. Why have you left me? Jesus knew, but Jesus connected himself to that God in Psalm 22. The words, my God, why have you forsaken me, come from David's psalm, the deer of the dawn. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me? From the words of my groaning. Oh my God, I cry day by day, but you do not answer. And by night, but find no rest. Yet you, oh God, are holy, enthroned on the praises of Israel. In you, our ancestors trusted. They trusted and you delivered them. To you they cried and were saved. In you they trusted and were not put to shame. You see, when Jesus felt forsaken, he connected himself to his ancestor David. Jesus knew things. Jesus knew the Torah, and he knew his ancestors Sarah and Abraham and Hagar. He knew Isaac and Ishmael and Jacob's 12 sons, including Judah, and Judah, the father of Perez and Zerah, by Tamar. Salmon, the father of Boaz by Rahab, and Boaz, the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the father of King David. Jesus knew to connect himself to the source of who he was. God and his ancestors who knew some things too. Jesus knew God, and not only did he know God through his family, he knew God close up and personal. Listen to the writer John in 5:19 and 30, where he says, very truly, this is Jesus talking to his disciples. Very truly, I tell you, the Son of Man can do nothing on his own, but only what he sees the Father doing, for the Father does. And for whatever the Father does, the Son does likewise. Jesus knew, even though he felt forsaken, that God had not left him. And John goes on to write these words that Jesus said, I can do nothing on my own. As I hear, I judge, and my judgment is just because I seek to do not my own will, but the will of him who sent me. Jesus knew some things. And because he knew, in that moment, theologians question whether Jesus really felt forsaken, or Jesus wanted us to know that Jesus knew what it felt like to be forsaken. Now, regardless of which one, Jesus said he felt forsaken. And he was naming his pain. Where in the world was God when his lifeblood was leaving him? Jesus was strange fruit. Maybe the original strange fruit. Abel Meropol was a Jewish school teacher from the Bronx. And he saw a gruesome photograph of the lynched and hanging bodies of two young black men. Their names were Thomas Shipp and Abram Smith. And when he saw the photograph of their lynching, he was horrified and sickened by it. And he dealt with his horror by writing the poem, Bitter Fruit, which was published in 1937 in the New York Teacher, a publication of the Teachers Union. Abel, a member of the American Communist Party, yes he was, later published it in the Marxist journal, The New Masses. It was early in 1939, after seeing Billie Holiday perform at the Cafe Society, an interracial club in Greenwich Village, New York. Meeropol showed her the poem and the version that he had put to music that had been sung by his wife, Anne. Billie Holiday liked it and worked with Meeropol and Sonny White to turn it into Strange Fruit. She writes in her autobiography, she was worried about singing it even at the Cafe Society, a place that catered to progressives. There wasn't even a patter of applause when she finished. She wrote, then a long person began to clap. Nervously. Then suddenly everybody was clapping. Her rendition made an enormous impression on that first audience, and most audiences that heard her sing the disturbing ballad. Southern trees bear strange fruit. Blood on the leaves and blood at the root. Black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. Pastoral scene of the gallant South, the bulging eyes and the twisted mouth. The scent of magnolias, sweet and fresh. Then the sudden smell of burning flesh. Here is the fruit for the crows to pluck, for the rain to gather, for the wind to suck, for the sun to rot, for the trees to drop. Here is a strange and bitter crop. Jesus was strange fruit. As he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" in the midst of being murdered by those who looked like him. Reverend Dr. O. Wesley Allen, Jr., professor of homiletics at Perkins School of Theology, wrote, "Why is Mark presenting Jesus in doubt at the end of a torturous life? This has to be the most biblically difficult thing to accept. How could Jesus, the Son of God, who knew in advance he was going to die, he had already told everybody, right, experience such anguish? It is an incredible act, God's beloveds, for us to trust God while we are being tortured, while we are being murdered, while mothers are watching their children being killed at school, while mothers and fathers sit and wait for their children to come home, while women, LGBTQ+ sisters and brothers, the poor who have to beg for a piece of bread to trust that God has not forgotten them. It is an incredible act for us who suffer and who witness suffering to say, God has not forgotten me. The question of why God allows the world that God created, to be mired in such suffering and evil is astounding. It is the question that we keep asking. Why, God? Why is this happening to me? Why is this happening to us? Why is it still happening? My pastor, the Reverend Dr. Cynthia Hale in Atlanta, Georgia, preached this sermon, and she said, "Why not you?" It happens to other people. Why not you? I didn't like that sermon. And I just left it, and it keeps coming back. But why does God allow evil to reign? I want to say to us today, maybe it's not God's business, it's ours. God has no hands but ours. God has no feet but ours. God is waiting for us to do what we need to do. And so as Jesus was on that cross with his breath getting shorter every minute, blood draining into the soil, Jesus connected to God and his ancestors. The continuum of life does not end. When I am with families who have lost loved ones, I say to them, I know this is hard. But they are not gone. From this realm, yes, but love never dies. And so we need to learn how to be with them in a different way. Jesus knew how to be with his ancestors in a different way. There's another thing, the connection is important, but there's another thing that Jesus shows us at this 3 o'clock hour. That doubting and questioning is okay. I loved the youth minister. He said, you don't have to have the answers, but we do have to start the conversation. We do have to want to listen to the pain. We have to sit in the space of death and listen and lament what is happening to us. I remember when my husband died, and my mother would say this all the time to everybody. We weren't born to stay here, Joanne. But when she said it to me, I didn't want to hear it that day. No, we're not born to stay here. But death is a dark, hard place. Not just physical death, but dying to self. If you want to keep your life, you must, what? You all know, you got to lose it, right? And so Jesus, in moments, maybe even seconds, named to God his pain. He lamented, just like in Psalms 22. On you I cast from my birth. On you I was cast from my birth, and since my mother bore me, you have been my God. Do not be far from me, for trouble is near, and there is no one to help. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It is melting within my breast. My mouth is dry like clay, and my tongue sticks to my jaws. David says, you lay me in the dust of death. They divide my clothes among themselves, and for my clothing they cast lots. But you, O God, do not be far away from me. On my help, come quickly to my aid. Deliver my soul. I will tell of your name to my brothers and sisters. In the midst of the congregation, I will sing your praise. Do you see that shift? He named the pain, David did. He lamented, and then he moved into praise. I will praise you, you who fear the Lord. Praise him, all you offspring of Jacob. Glorify him. Stand in awe of him, all you offspring of Israel. Yes, God's beloveds, let us be faithful and true and genuine and say, I don't see you, God. You left me. Let us lament it, but keep all of our attention on God. In the midst of all of that pain, Jesus kept his attention on God. He wasn't distracted, though I don't know how he couldn't have been. Jesus, even though he feels God has left him, does not leave God. The women did not leave Christ either as they witnessed his lynching. Ernest Hess of Covenant Presbyterian Church writes, the women have done two things. The males in the community found it impossible. They have been servants, and they continued to follow Jesus even after he was arrested and executed. Let us lament, but never leave our attention from God. And lastly, God's presence confirmed that God was there. How? The miracle of day turning into night. The whole universe shifted that day. Some scholars say that God was grieving, and so everything, the light left the room. Also, the death of Jesus was borne witness to by two unexpected people. The thief on the cross who said, Jesus, let me be with you in paradise. He knew some things. The Roman soldier, state-sanctioned killer, when Jesus took his last breath, said, truly, this man was God's son. The temple curtain being torn in two from top to bottom. The evidence that God's presence was with Jesus. And so whether Jesus really meant that he felt forsaken or whether he didn't, we know the rest of the story. God's victory is always sure. So whether it was that God wanted to show us that she really knew what it was like to suffer, or whether we needed to know for ourselves that God never leaves us or forsakes us. These words are true, that God's love and presence endures forever. Amen.
Speak to and through me. Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. Innocent,
Strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees.
innocently yet lynched, an execution, a joyous time for some, standing together to celebrate and witness.
The bulging eyes and the twisted mouth.
That strange fruit was, yes, fully human and fully divine. Thirst. Jesus said, I thirst. Martin Luther describes the verse, John 19:29, in this way. When agonizing in the midst of the terrors and pangs of divine wrath and death that surpasses all human thought and comprehension, what was he saying? Simply, God reminding us of Christ's humanity, being fully human, experiencing all our emotions, suffocating, hanging on the cross. And yes, his humanity got thirsty. The divinities, what is the divinity, the divine part of Christ saying? He, this strange fruit, was, according to Isaiah 53:5, he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him. And with his stripes, church, we are healed. Iniquities. Our intentions. Can you imagine people at that time not honoring humanity's last request for water? Instead, they gave the divine hyssop. Could our intentions be misplaced, misoriented towards injustice, towards lack of empathy, accountability, when our world still contains systems of injustice, of imbalance, persecution, and suffocation of diversity, equity, and power. Christ thirsts for our intentions to be Christ-centered. Nothing ever justifies the lynching of Black lives, trans lives, women, and children. Redemption. Redemption through Christ. That's what the divine is thirsting for. An opportunity for reconciliation for our own humanity. The divinity within each of us desires to return to each other and once again, church, see each and everyone to see each other. S, our senses, our sight. We are able to see through who, where, the eyes of Christ, seeing through the eyes of Christ, to see a world, as Martin Luther King calls us, where we are not judged by the color of our what? Skin, but by the content of our character. Christ-like centered, simply in the words of Micah 6:8, which is my favorite verse. Simply, what does Christ require? The divine requires that we do justly, to love kindness, mercy, and to walk humbly with God. T, this.
Here is a strange and bitter cry.
I thirst.
John 19:30. When Jesus had received the wine, he said, "It is finished." Then he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. It is finished. Jesus understood the assignment, but some Christians misinterpreted and misrepresented the message. To be fair, Jesus understood the assignment from the beginning because in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. It is finished in Jesus' meaning is that he had completed his assignment. He had completed the will and work of his Father. Throughout the book of John, Jesus is seen on earth where he revealed himself to be the Word made flesh, light of the world, Son of God, giver of abundant and overflowing life, because he is the living water who turned water to wine. He revealed himself as the dwelling place, tabernacle, and ladder to heaven. And on that night, his actions revealed why John the Baptist called him the Lamb of God. In John, he carries his own cross. He did not attempt to take himself off the cross. He did not call on God to bring down a multitude of angels to rescue him. To complete the assignment, he bowed his own head. He gave up his own spirit. Jesus allowed the powers of evil to try to devour him as a means of disarming them. He knew he would conquer death, hell, and the grave. He knew the assignment. But some Christians misinterpreted and misrepresented the message. Some Christians misrepresented the message by cutting out portions related to loving your neighbor and salvation being for all people. Some Christians intentionally misrepresented salvation as a means of cheap grace, knowing all along that their eye is focused on their idol, the dollar, rather than on God and the flourishing of God's creation. That's how we got the doctrine of discovery, right? And that's how we got slavery. Some Christians misused and abused the message as a tool to demand enslaved people obey the people identifying themselves as master. That's how we got strange fruit. I hear music in the air. A sound is still heard in Ramah, the sound of wailing and weeping. No more weeping and wailing. A sound is heard in the Cape Coast Castle in Ghana. The sound of wailing and weeping. No more weeping and wailing. On the ships used in the Middle Passage. No more in Jamaica, in Haiti, in Dominican Republic. No more in America. In America? In America, no more. Were you there? Did you hear him say, "It is finished"? It is finished. It was supposed to be finished. No more sacrifices. Jesus paid it all. No more weeping. In James Cone's groundbreaking work, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, he wrote, "Just as the old slave spiritual, were you there, placed Black Christians at the foot of Jesus' cross, strange fruit put them at the foot of the lynching tree." Cone followed this with this vital question: how could white Christians reconcile the strange fruit they hung on southern trees with the strange fruit Romans hung on the cross of Golgotha? Well, once upon a time, lynchings were part of the entertainment at some church picnics. And once upon a time, lynching was replicated in a Hollywood film, Birth of a Nation, and debuted at the White House. Once upon a time, Black bodies hanging from trees were advertised on postcards. Once upon a time, body parts from lynched people were cut up, placed in mason jars on display in a shopkeeper's window for pride and purchase. Cone's question about the disconnect between the southern trees and the old rugged cross in the white Christian imagination remains relevant today because, unfortunately, we know that the strange fruit does not only hang on southern trees, but on trees all across America. We know that despite Christ's declaration that it is finished, lynchings continue in America, and that strange fruit hangs not only on trees, but also in prisons, schools, and homes. We also know that while postcards may be the marketing tool of the past, lynchings of Black bodies are now replayed as trauma porn on the evening news, TikTok, Twitter, and Instagram. Moreover, the violent acts continue to be performed at the hands of white Christians in America. Finally, lynchings of Black bodies at the hands of white Christians continue in America with both the blessing and the silence of white churches. When he said, "It is finished," he meant that his work he came to do here on earth was completed. He was done. Fini. There is no more need for sacrifice. Some Christians have misrepresented the message to cause people to believe they are supposed to subject themselves to the violence Christ suffered. This has not been a helpful teaching in the Black community. It is understandable that some Black Christians identify with Jesus because he expressed love for all creation and because he faced oppression and violence. So this makes Jesus both ethical and empathic. It is important to clarify that God never assigned Black people to be a sacrifice for the rest of humanity. God never assigned Black people to subject ourselves to violence without resisting. God certainly never created us to subject ourselves to being shot in the back, shot in our beds, shot on the playground, shot in our cars at a traffic stop, shot in the grocery store, shot at a prayer meeting in church, hunted while selling cigarettes, hunted while jogging, hunting while walking home from the convenience store, accosted while bird watching, accosted while trying to get on the elevator of our home, accosted while selling water, and the multitude of other acts of violence perpetrated against us. Jesus' sacrifice was meant to be once and for all. It was not meant to be replicated. Black people have summoned the world to say their names, not because we are calling on the names as a means of salvation, not because we believe they are like Jesus or that they are in fact Jesus. We are saying their names so they will not be forgotten as human beings, and in the hopes that there will be no more need for a hashtag, because there will be no more names to add to the hashtag list. Were you there? Did you hear him say, "It is finished"? It is finished. Amen.
Now, as we prepare to bury Jesus in the tomb, and then step into our privileges of being able to go home safely, into our privileges of being able to be annoyed that we are in worship for more than an hour, I remind us tonight that Good Friday worships most often do not afford us the comfort of concluding with the hope and blessings of a benediction. They are intended to create space for us to reflect on the death, the legalized murder of Jesus the Christ. They are intended to create space for us to be present, to remember the depravities of humanity, to be present with the sadness and ugliness of our past and present existential realities. So this year, through the lyrics of Strange Fruit, we have invited you to these sacred reflections through the relationship between the cross and the lynching tree. Thank you, James Cone, for the book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree. Thank you, Billie Holiday, for the song Strange Fruit. So in lieu of a typical benediction, we invite you tonight to take with you the last of Jesus' 7 sayings. Father, into thy hand I commend my spirit. We ask that you take this saying with you tonight while remembering that over 2,000 years ago, an innocent man of color was falsely accused and arrested, tried and found guilty, sentenced to death by execution, and his lynching was legal. We ask you to remember that between then and modern times, lynchings have not stopped. They continue. We ask you to take this saying with you while remembering that over 2,000 years later, today, lynchings are still happening. I don't need to tell you how, for the preachers have spoken. But I do want to tell you that these lynchings are not always what we expect, that they sometimes show up simply as public disrespects and humiliations, public dismissals, such as what happened last night in Nashville. Take this saying with you, Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit, and ask yourself, were these faith-filled words of hope and great expectation? Were these words spoken in the be still and know that God is God moment? Were these faith-filled words of thanksgiving, gratitude, that one's race is complete, that one's assignment is finished, that the job is done? Or were these words of exasperation and hopelessness, a heartbreaking reckoning, realization, and acceptance that there is no hope for the oppressor, that the empire is never going to change?
Southern trees bear a strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root, black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit the sudden smell of burning flesh. Here is the fruit for the cross.